In the dark expanse of space, where stars flickered like the cold eyes of distant watchers, a single human transport vessel drifted through the Mardika Nebula. Lieutenant Jason Kline was one of the few remaining soldiers aboard, tasked with enforcing the armistice between humans and the Maktar Dominion, a powerful alien empire with a reputation for ruthlessness. Their empress, the revered and feared Zaurala, ruled the empire with both wisdom and a chilling pragmatism. Though peace was new and fragile, the last skirmish had ended nearly a year ago, leaving behind scars in many forms. But tonight was different. A faint distress signal had been received, barely audible through the distortion of the nebula. Jason leaned forward in his cockpit, narrowing his eyes as he strained to hear more than static. After hours of mundane patrol, any signal would have broken the monotony, but this one sounded particularly haunting. He picked out something like a scream, then a sharp silence. Unease prickled the back of his neck. "What are you listening to?" Kline Corporal Melissa Arnett asked, poking her head into the cramped cockpit. She was younger than Jason, eager but grounded, with a sharp mind that rarely missed a beat. Jason tapped the dashboard with a sigh. "Some signal. It's odd, more like an alert than a call for backup. And it's not human." Melissa frowned, checking her watch. "Maktar? They're the only ones out here besides us." Maybe Jason's hands moved over the console as he adjusted the transmission frequency, hoping to filter out more of the background interference. After a few seconds, another faint voice came through, desperate, pleading, but incomprehensible. Then silence. He and Melissa exchanged a glance, her face mirroring his curiosity and caution. Jason hesitated before pressing the intercom. Kline to bridge. "Captain, we've got something strange. Possible distress signal, unidentified origin." There was a pause before Captain Ross's gruff voice came over the line. "Can you confirm if it's Maktar or human?" "Hard to tell, sir. Could be Maktar. Permission to investigate." The line crackled with tension before the captain replied. "Granted. Keep it quiet. I don't want to risk stirring up a conflict." Jason nodded and quickly brought their ship around, plotting a course toward the source of the signal. The coordinates took them into the denser regions of the nebula, where glowing clouds of gas shrouded them in eerie blues and greens. Swirling eddies cast strange shadows across the cockpit as they approached a derelict Maktar vessel, its hull breached and blackened. Melissa leaned forward, her face close to the glass. "Looks like it's been hit. Badly. Could be a rebel attack." "Or something worse," Jason muttered, already calculating the possible scenarios. A Maktar ship out here in the middle of human-patrolled space was unusual. If it was a transport or even a low-ranking diplomatic vessel, they could have important intel or injured allies. As they docked with the Maktar vessel, the silence stretched out, thick with foreboding. Jason pulled on his helmet, checked his weapon, and nodded to Melissa, who did the same. They entered the airlock and waited as the hissing of decompressing chambers filled the small space. Once aboard, they were met with darkness and the faint smell of something acrid and burnt. Jason flicked on his helmet light, casting a narrow beam through the shadows. The corridors were empty, but scorch marks and gouges in the walls suggested a fierce battle had recently taken place. There was blood, thick and black, smeared across the floor and walls. "Stay close," Jason whispered, his voice barely audible through their comms. He felt a presence lurking in the dark, though he couldn't see it. As they rounded a corner, they heard a faint whimper, barely audible over the hum of the ship's failing systems. Jason raised his hand, signaling Melissa to halt. She nodded, her weapon poised and ready. Following the sound, they moved deeper into the bowels of the ship, the darkness pressing in on them. The whimper grew louder, accompanied by a rasping breath. Jason finally spotted the source, a young Maktar, perhaps no older than 10 by human standards, huddled against the wall with wide, fearful eyes. Clad in torn armor, the creature's sharp fangs glinted under the beam of his light, yet its body language was unmistakable. It was terrified. Jason's instinctive hostility softened as he took in the sight. The child was trembling, wounded, and alone. "What do we do?" Melissa whispered, glancing at Jason, her own eyes reflecting a mixture of sympathy and caution. Jason hesitated, but the answer came with surprising clarity. "We help him. That's what we do." He lowered his weapon and slowly approached the young Maktar, who flinched and hissed but didn't attack. "It's okay," Jason murmured, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "We're here to help." The child's yellow eyes darted between them, wary but desperate. After a moment, it seemed to relax slightly, though the fear remained etched on its scaled face. Jason reached for the medkit strapped to his side and pulled out a bandage. The young alien tensed, but Jason held up a hand, showing him the bandage. See? Just to help with the wound. Melissa watched in awe as Jason knelt down, carefully wrapping the child's injured leg. Can you understand me? He asked, keeping his tone gentle. The young Maktar tilted its head, a glimmer of understanding in its eyes. Slowly it nodded. Jason's relief was palpable. But then, without warning, footsteps echoed down the corridor, heavy and purposeful. The sound of metal striking metal reverberated as a figure emerged from the shadows, a Maktar warrior, clad in ornate armor and wielding a deadly, curved weapon. It took only an instant for Jason to recognize her Empress Zaurala herself, the iron-fisted leader of the Maktar Dominion. Her gaze fell on Jason, then shifted to the child huddled beside him. Her expression, usually unreadable, showed a flicker of something shock, maybe even dismay. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. The Empress regarded the scene with cold intensity, her gaze piercing into Jason as though searching his soul. This child, she said finally, her voice a low, menacing rumble. Why are you helping him, human? Jason swallowed, his voice steady but respectful. He's just a kid. He's hurt and scared. I couldn't leave him here to die. Zaurala's eyes narrowed, her weapon glinting under the sparse light. Your kind are not known for such mercy. Jason didn't flinch. Maybe not. But I couldn't turn my back on him. Not when I could help. The Empress took a step closer, her posture unreadable but her gaze fierce. You may think your actions noble, soldier, but to us, compassion is not a sign of strength. Maybe, Jason replied, his tone unwavering. But that's not how I see it. Zaurala's eyes shifted briefly to the child, who looked up at her with a mix of fear and awe. Jason couldn't tell if she felt any attachment to the young Maktar, but her stance softened, if only for a moment. She took a long, slow breath. If you truly believe that mercy matters, you must understand it comes with consequences. I may let you live today, but don't think for a moment that the Maktar forget or forgive. Jason didn't move, but he could feel Melissa tense behind him. The Empress gave him one last, searing look before she turned to the child, speaking in their native tongue. The child, though still trembling, seemed to take comfort in her words. Without another glance, Zaurala walked past them and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Jason and Melissa alone with the child. He let out a long breath, his pulse beginning to slow. But he knew that this encounter had set something in motion, something that would ripple far beyond this ship and this moment. And somehow he felt sure that he hadn't seen the last of Empress Zaurala. Jason and Melissa guided the young Maktar through the empty, damaged corridors of the ship. The child limped beside Jason, his clawed hand clutching the soldier's gloved fingers with surprising trust. Despite the recent encounter with the Empress, Jason's mind buzzed with questions. Why had she let them go? More importantly, why was a young Maktar alone, far from any family or guards? Melissa's voice crackled through his earpiece. Kline, what are we doing here? This is risky. If anyone catches us with him, it could start another war. Jason nodded, but his answer held firm. I know. But if we leave him here, he won't survive. And besides, didn't you see her reaction? That wasn't just a soldier we saved, she knew him, Melissa. If there's a way to bring him back to her, maybe this could turn into a rare chance for diplomacy. Her silence told him she understood, if reluctantly. They made their way back to their own vessel, carefully avoiding any remaining patrols and cloaking their presence. Once they'd reached the airlock, Jason secured the ship for departure and ushered the child into one of the safer rooms in the medical bay. The child, whose name, as they discovered, was K. Renus, remained silent but observant, his bright eyes darting around as if cataloging every detail. As Jason checked the child's wounds, he noted the markings along his arm, symbols that distinguished the noble lineages within the Maktar society. K. Renus was of high rank, perhaps even a relative of Empress Zaurala herself. Melissa hovered near the door, watching with a wary expression. You really think the Empress will care? What if she just turns on us when we bring him back? I don't know, Jason shrugged, his gaze flicking down to K. Renus. But we're already on this path. If this leads to something bigger, we'll handle it. Besides, he added with a smile, maybe this could be the first time humans and Maktar actually work together for something beyond warfare. K. Renus regarded Jason with those piercing yellow eyes, but his expression softened, as if he understood more than they'd given him credit for. Hours passed in tense quiet as they drifted further into neutral space, the sensors on high alert for any sign of Maktar pursuit. But the stillness felt fragile, like the calm before an inevitable storm. Jason was prepared for it, though he'd spent too many years in skirmishes with Maktar forces to let his guard down. Sure enough, the alert blared without warning, and the ship shook violently as it was caught in a tractor beam. Jason's pulse quickened as the sensors confirmed his suspicions a Maktar warcruiser had locked onto them. "They must have tracked us," Melissa said, gripping her console as the ship lurched again. "Jason, we need to get out of here." "There's no outrunning them. They'll tear us apart if we try," Jason said, staring at the looming cruiser on the monitor. Suddenly, Renus stood up from his seat in the corner, his small face resolute. He pointed to the console, his alien accent thick but his voice unwavering. "Speak to her. My mother." Jason froze. Mother? This child wasn't just a noble, he was the Empress's son. The comm system crackled to life, filling the room with the cold, controlled voice of Empress Zaurala. "Human vessel, surrender or prepare to be destroyed. You have something precious to me." Jason took a deep breath, his mind racing. If Zaurala was as ruthless as her reputation suggested, this might be their only chance at survival. He glanced at Renus, who nodded as if urging him forward. Swallowing his nerves, Jason responded, his voice steady but tense. "Empress Zaurala, this is Lieutenant Jason Kline. Your son is safe aboard our vessel. He was injured and alone, but we helped him. I'm prepared to return him to you peacefully." There was a long silence before Zaurala's reply came, colder than before. "You have no bargaining power, Lieutenant, and I am not swayed by mercy. Hand him over or your crew will pay." Jason clenched his fists, struggling to keep his voice calm. "I'm not trying to bargain. We found him and saved his life because it was the right thing to do. We're bringing him back to you, not for leverage, but because he's your son. Isn't that worth something?" The comm line crackled, but Zaurala didn't respond. Instead, a secondary channel opened, and a voice softer but filled with restrained rage whispered through. "You may have saved my son, human, but that does not erase centuries of war. I will spare you this once. But know this, the Maktar do not forget." The tractor beam released, and the war cruiser pulled away, its engines humming as it slowly turned. The Empress's face appeared briefly on the monitor, her expression a mask of both anger and something unspoken, a mother's relief, hidden beneath a warrior's pride. In the silence that followed, Renus looked at Jason, an unspoken bond forming between them. Jason gave him a nod, recognizing the profound impact of what had just happened. For perhaps the first time, a human in Maktar had chosen trust over bloodshed. But he knew this was only the beginning. Jason let out a long breath, leaning back in his seat as the war cruiser's engines faded from their sensors. Renus had nestled into a bunk nearby, watching Jason and Melissa with a tentative curiosity. Despite the release from immediate danger, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that they'd just stepped into something far larger than themselves. Melissa broke the silence, her voice tense. "So we're just letting him go?" Jason nodded slowly. "It's not about letting him go. It's about the fact that he's not just some kid. He's the Empress's son. If we hold on to him, it'll trigger a full-scale war. But maybe, just maybe, helping him back to her gives us a shot at something more than just survival out here." As they prepared to enter Maktar space to return Renus, Jason's mind spun with the implications. His actions had created a fragile link, a small symbol of trust. But he had no illusions trust between species wasn't forged overnight, and he doubted Empress Zaurala's mercy would extend any further than her son's safe return. They navigated through the dense asteroid fields that marked the edge of Maktar territory, passing checkpoints and security probes that scanned them with clinical precision. Jason knew that any deviation would be met with immediate force. But as they approached the Maktar capital, Renus grew increasingly restless, glancing from the viewports to Jason with an expression that bordered on fear. "What's wrong?" Jason asked, kneeling beside the young prince, his tone gentle but concerned. Renus lowered his gaze, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mother. She won't be happy. I should not have been on that ship." Melissa's eyebrows shot up. "Wait, what? You weren't supposed to be there." The young Maktar nodded solemnly, his reptilian features marked by a mix of shame and fear. "I wanted to see the stars, see what the human territory was like. I disobeyed." Jason processed this information with a grimace. Zaurala's anger might not only be directed at them but also at her son. He understood that the Empress wouldn't hesitate to discipline Renus for jeopardizing Maktar security, even if he was her only child. And the more he thought about it, the more Jason realized that Renus might be facing more than a scolding. The Maktar were known for their brutal, unyielding adherence to discipline. Jason shared a look with Melissa, We can't just leave him if she's going to punish him for getting caught. He's a kid. Melissa sighed, but her expression softened. I know. But what can we do? The Empress already sees us as enemies. Interfering won't make her think twice. Rennis's eyes shone with gratitude, but the sadness lingered. I understand, human. I am Maktar. I must be strong. Jason felt a pang of sympathy for the child's acceptance of his fate, but he didn't let it show. Listen, Rennis. If there's anything you want us to do or say to your mother, we will. Just know that you're not alone in this. Rennis nodded, his gaze steadying with a glimmer of hope. Jason's resolve hardened. They'd do whatever they could to protect him, even if it meant testing the Empress's patience once again. The landing on the Maktar capital planet Draenac was tense. Massive warships drifted above the dark, volcanic landscape, casting shadows over the brutalist architecture of the Maktar capital city. Jason could feel the oppressive heat through his suit as he and Melissa led Rennis from the ship, flanked by a small detachment of human guards. They were met by Maktar soldiers, their eyes cold and wary. At the head of their ranks stood Empress Zaurala, her presence radiating authority and fury. Her gaze zeroed in on Rennis, and for the first time Jason saw something raw and fierce beneath her stern exterior. Mother Rennis murmured, bowing his head. Zaurala's lip twitched, the barest hint of emotion crossing her face. She looked at Jason, her eyes hard. You have returned my son. I owe you a debt, human. But do not think it will save you from the repercussions of this transgression. Jason met her gaze, unflinching. I understand, Empress. But I ask that you consider this your son took a great risk. And we took one, too, to ensure his safety. Maybe this doesn't need to be more than that. For a moment, silence reigned, each side waiting for Zaurala's response. Her eyes narrowed as she looked between her son and Jason, suspicion, and something else, perhaps a trace of respect reflecting in her gaze. She straightened, her voice carrying authority as she addressed her soldiers. The humans will be allowed safe passage. But know that this changes nothing between our people. You will leave and not return. Rennis, who had remained silent, suddenly spoke up. Mother, they saved me. They could have left me, but they didn't. I want to thank them. Zaurala stiffened, her expression unreadable, but she gave a terse nod. Thank them, and then come with me. Rennis turned to Jason, bowing with an odd mix of human and Maktar gestures. Thank you, Jason Kline, for everything. Jason smiled, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. Take care of yourself, Rennis, and remember, you're not alone out here. But as Jason and Melissa returned to their ship, he couldn't shake the feeling that the Empress's parting words held more weight than she'd let on. This changes nothing. Perhaps she meant that between their people, peace was still as fragile as ever. But something about Rennis's survival, about this brief bridge of trust, felt like it had indeed changed everything. And not just for him. Back aboard the ship, Jason and Melissa were hailed by Captain Ross, who was waiting with a mixture of relief and frustration. Lieutenant, you've made quite the impression with the Maktar. There's a diplomatic envoy requesting to debrief you on the entire mission. Jason groaned, already dreading the political intricacies. Yes, sir. We'll be back at the station shortly. But as he glanced out the viewport at the distant, looming shapes of Maktar ships, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just planted a seed, one that could grow into peace or explode into war. Only time would tell. In the days following their return, Jason and Melissa found themselves subjected to endless debriefings by military officials. They scrutinized every moment of the mission, probing Jason's decision to help Rennis, his contact with Empress Zaurala, and the risks he'd taken to return her son. Jason remained resolute, refusing to regret his choice. He'd saved a child, a future leader, even regardless of species. But he knew the brass didn't share his idealism. After a particularly grueling session, he returned to his quarters, feeling exhausted. Just as he sank into his chair, his communication terminal pinged with an encrypted message marked priority. Curious, he accepted the transmission, and to his surprise, the holographic form of a Maktar representative materialized before him. The figure wore a neutral expression, but the insignia on his chest bore the mark of the imperial family. Lieutenant Jason Kline, greetings. I am Aaron, a diplomatic envoy for Empress Zaurala, he said in the steady, clipped tones of the Maktar. The Empress has requested your presence in a confidential meeting to discuss an urgent matter involving the young prince. Your presence is required at the outer sector embassy within the hour. Jason's eyebrows shot up. Is the prince all right? Aaron's gaze was unreadable. That is precisely why you are summoned, Lieutenant. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving Jason alone with his thoughts. The summons was unusual. Zaurala had made it clear that Jason and his crew were not welcome in Maktar territory. But something urgent had clearly changed her mind, and Jason couldn't ignore it. If it involved Kline, he knew he had to go. He gathered his gear and notified Melissa, who insisted on coming along. The embassy was located in the dimly lit expanse of the neutral zone, a gray and metallic building that blended with the cold, star-speckled blackness outside. They were met by Aaron, who led them through a series of corridors until they reached a large, domed room where Empress Zaurala herself awaited, her presence as formidable as ever. Beside her stood Kline, his expression troubled, his eyes flickering between Jason and his mother. Zaurala inclined her head, a gesture of cold acknowledgement. Lieutenant Kline, Corporal Arnett, I summoned you because you have become entangled in matters that concern the very core of the Maktar Empire. Jason exchanged a brief, worried glance with Melissa before addressing the Empress. We're here to help. Whatever the issue, if it's about Kline, we'll do what we can. Zaurala's sharp gaze bore into him. My son's reckless venture into human space was more than a foolish escapade. It revealed to me a weakness in our ranks, one that enemies within the Maktar Dominion seek to exploit. The Empress's voice grew cold. A faction of high-ranking Maktar generals, opposed to the peace treaty, have discovered Kline's actions and are using them to argue that I have grown weak and sympathetic toward humans. They've already spread word of his journey, twisting it into evidence of my failure as a leader. My son's life is now in danger, as is the peace between our peoples. Jason felt a chill at her words. What do you need from us? Zaurala's gaze softened, just slightly, as she glanced down at Kline. You risked your life for him once. Now I ask you to do it again. Take him to a secure location until I can root out the dissidents. He will be safer in human territory, hidden from those who would use him to strike at me. Jason glanced at Kline, who met his gaze with quiet resolve. Though he was young, the weight of his mother's decision was not lost on him. Of course we'll protect him, Jason replied, his voice steady. But this could be dangerous possibly for both our species. If your enemies see him with us, they may see it as an alliance. The Empress nodded grimly. Yes, and that is why time is critical. If we do not act, Kline will not live to see the throne, and our peace treaty will shatter. Jason understood the gravity of the task. This was more than protecting a child, it was protecting the future stability of human-Maktar relations. He looked at Melissa, who gave him a terse nod. They were in this together. Without further delay, Zaurala and Aaron provided them with a small transport vessel and directed them to a hidden outpost on the edge of human-controlled space. The journey there was tense and silent, with Kline watching the stars pass by with an expression of sorrow and longing. The outpost, nestled in a desolate asteroid field, was simple but secure. Jason and Melissa kept a tight schedule, rotating shifts and monitoring their limited communications to avoid detection. Though life on the run was isolating, they developed a strange kinship with the young Maktar prince, who revealed a side of himself that surprised them both. One evening, as Jason sat beside Kline in the makeshift galley, the boy spoke quietly, his eyes fixed on the dimly lit stars outside. I am meant to lead one day, to be strong. But my people, they see strength as something fierce, like a storm. Jason nodded, listening closely. And you? Don't see it that way. Kline shook his head. Strength is more than power. It is knowing when to protect. Even an enemy. Jason felt a wave of respect for the young prince, seeing in him a maturity that belied his years. Kline's insight showed a different path for the Maktar, one that could lead to a new kind of peace. Just as Jason was about to respond, the alarm blared, a harsh staccato sound that froze them both. Jason dashed to the control room, Melissa already at the sensors, her face tight with fear. They've found us, she whispered. Maktar ships, 3 of them. They've already breached our perimeter. Jason's stomach twisted. He'd known they couldn't hide forever, but this felt like a nightmare. He activated the comm, his mind racing. Empress Zaurala, this is Lieutenant Kline. We're compromised enemy Maktar ships on approach. We need backup or we won't make it out of here. The only response was static, their signal jammed by the enemy ships. Jason cursed, gripping the controls as the vessel shook under the force of an approaching ship's fire. They were alone. Kline stood beside him, pale but calm. I can talk to them. They might listen. Jason shook his head. If they're Zaurala's enemies, they won't care. They want you gone. But Kaeranus didn't retreat. He stepped forward, taking Jason's hand. Then, we fight. Together. Jason felt a surge of admiration, but he knew their options were few. As the enemy ships closed in, Jason issued an order to prepare their defenses, but he knew they were outgunned. At the last moment, the sensors pinged with a new signal. A fleet of human and Maktar ships, bearing Zaurala's crest, blinked onto their radar, descending upon the enemy with lethal precision. The battle was swift and fierce, but Zaurala's forces overwhelmed the rebels, obliterating the ships that sought to end her son's life. When the skirmish ended, the Empress herself transmitted a message. Her face, projected on the screen, held a mixture of relief and pride as she gazed at her son. You have shown courage, Kaeranus, and perhaps it is time I learned from it. Kaeranus' face brightened, but he held his composure, nodding solemnly. Turning to Jason, Zaurala's expression softened. You have saved my son twice, Lieutenant, and in doing so you have protected both our peoples. Today we honor a bond, one of trust, not mere tolerance. Jason dipped his head, recognizing the gravity of her words. He knew this wouldn't end centuries of animosity overnight, but perhaps it was the beginning of a new era where peace could be forged, not from fear, but from respect. And as they returned to the human outpost, with Kaeranus safe and hopeful for the first time, Jason knew that he had found an ally in the unlikeliest of places. The future was uncertain, but for the first time it was a future where unity seemed possible. As the fleet returned to human-controlled space, Jason felt the weight of everything that had happened settling on his shoulders. His decision to protect Kaeranus had not only saved the child's life but had also sparked a dialogue between humans and the Maktar, a chance for something beyond the unsteady armistice they'd clung to for years. In the days following their return, an official summit was announced, one that would bring together representatives of both species to discuss a more lasting peace. Empress Zaurala had personally requested Jason to act as a diplomatic liaison, representing humanity alongside seasoned ambassadors. Though he was a soldier, not a diplomat, Jason accepted, seeing it as the next step in his responsibility toward the future he'd inadvertently helped shape. Melissa accompanied him as they traveled to the designated meeting place, a newly constructed station within neutral space, bustling with delegates from both sides. The station had a stark elegance, with expansive conference rooms made from shining alloy, transparent walls offering breathtaking views of the stars. The entire place felt alive with tension, a mix of hope and skepticism. Jason and Melissa joined a round table where high-ranking human officials exchanged guarded nods with Maktar representatives. To his surprise, Kaeranus sat beside Zaurala, his small stature dwarfed by her imposing presence, yet his expression was one of maturity and resolve. Empress Zaurala began the discussions, her voice strong and resonant. Humans, for centuries we have clashed, viewing each other as rivals in a galaxy we share but do not understand. Lieutenant Kline, through his actions, showed me that trust, while fragile, is a possibility. Today, I ask you to consider what might come if we choose cooperation instead of mutual destruction. Her words were met with murmurs from both sides, some nodding in agreement, others murmuring in dissent. Jason could feel the weight of her gaze as she looked at him, a silent signal for him to speak. Clearing his throat, he leaned forward. Our peoples have spent too long fighting. I know trust won't be built in a day, but we have a chance here, a chance to move beyond the fighting and build something lasting. Peace isn't easy, it's the hardest thing we can try. But I believe it's worth the risk. For the first time, Kaeranus spoke up, his voice clear and carrying the weight of someone far older. I will lead the Maktar one day, and I have seen what bravery and kindness look like even in a human. My people must know this, we can be more than enemies. The room fell silent, Kaeranus' words hanging in the air. Slowly, the human ambassador leaned forward, speaking directly to Zaurala. Empress, if your son, a future leader of the Maktar, sees this as a path forward, then we will meet you there. Perhaps a pilot program, exchange programs, joint research, something that allows both our people to see each other as allies rather than threats. Zaurala nodded, a faint smile tugging at her mouth. An alliance based on common goals, yes, that is a start. Over the following months, joint projects were initiated between human and Maktar teams, creating small but symbolic steps toward cooperation. Jason and Melissa, though still soldiers, became unofficial ambassadors, helping foster relationships, organize exchanges, and protect the new alliance's interests. One day, as Jason walked through the corridors of the human Maktar research outpost, he encountered Kaeranus, who was observing one of the human engineers assembling a new piece of experimental technology. The boy's fascination with the process was obvious, and he didn't hesitate to ask questions, his young mind eager to understand. Seeing Jason, Renus looked up and smiled. "I want to know everything about your technology. Maybe one day we can make ships that combine the best of both worlds." Jason chuckled. "I think that's a great goal. Maybe you'll lead us into a new era of exploration, one where we're not so quick to jump into battle." Renus's expression grew serious. "I want to, Jason. Because of you, I know peace is worth fighting for." As they watched the stars together, Jason felt a deep sense of hope for the future. He knew there would be challenges, resistance from both sides, and likely even new threats. But for the first time, he saw a path forward, one lit by a bond that had begun in the darkest of circumstances, but had grown into something that could last generations. Human and Maktar, united in purpose, could now look toward the stars with a shared dream. And so, with their efforts just beginning, Jason Renus and all those who believed in peace stood at the dawn of a new era, one where unity was more than just an idea but a promise for the future.